Majoring on Marriage, Part 2, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Welcome to our mini-series on marriage here in the middle of 1 Peter. We preach through books of the Bible here at First Baptist, and so we're lingering here 3 weeks. Last week we made 2 statements about God's design for marriage. This week we unpack a little more detail. Next week we conclude 2 statements each for 3 weeks. Let me remind you that we said that design is divisive. Design is the fork in the road. People either accept it or they reject it. They either rejoice in God's design or they rebel against it. You either look at this world and see that God designed it, that He's the wise and perfect creator of all, and rejoice that He made it for His glory and our joy, or you attribute all that you see to some sort of random process without design. In the same way, when it comes to human relationships, you either believe that God designed the family and marriage and friendships and churches, or we've made it up ourselves. We've constructed it as human beings. We are the creators of our own relationships, and we can do them however we please. We said design is divisive. It's also detailed. God made our eyes to be more complex and more powerful and more functional than anything that scientists can come up with. No one's replicated the human hand yet, the human brain. God makes us and our organs very detailed. And so as we look at statements 3 and 4 today, we're going to dig into some of the details of how God expects men and women to relate in marriage. I'm going to read you the first 2 statements from last week, read the passage from 1 Peter, and then we'll delve in. We said last week, number 1, God created gender, marriage, and relational roles. And number 2, God blesses or disciplines marital attitudes and actions. Here's our passage from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. I encourage you at home to have your Bibles open. Beginning in verse 1. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be in the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a quiet and gentle spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as the fellow heir of grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. I see statement number 3. Each partner has independent, voluntary, supportive roles. Each partner has independent, voluntary, supportive roles, and we're going to unpack each one of these. The first thing I see is that each partner has an independent role. That is, the command to the husband in verse 7 is unequivocal, unilateral, unconditional. The husband must treat his wife a certain way, regardless of how she acts. This command to live with your wives in an understanding way does not depend upon what the wife does. Maybe he has a bossy wife who's always telling him what to do. Or maybe he has a belittling wife. Maybe one of you listening to this today has that, a wife who's always cutting you down in private and public. Maybe he has a betraying wife who can't keep the vows of their marriage. No matter what she does, he is to live with her in an understanding way. He is to sacrifice himself for her. I'm going to use sacrifice using the words of Paul as a substitute here, so that sacrifice of the husband matches the submission of the wife. The husband is to sacrifice all that he has for his wife unconditionally under all circumstances. It does not depend upon what his wife does. Peter doesn't say, if your wife does this, then do that. That's not the Bible. And I see that the wife, verse 1, must treat her husband in a certain way, regardless of how he acts. She's called to submission. No matter what quality of husband she has, no matter what he does, she is to submit. She is to treat him with submission, and he is to treat her with sacrifice, and they have independent roles before God. Now, I know this is difficult because we've been trained since childhood that reciprocal relationships are right. To have balanced relationships is healthy. Our parents told us you move towards good kids and away from bad kids. We learned in school, people who are mean to you, just back off or retaliate. Be nice to those who are nice, get away from those who are not. In this way, Jesus is simply calling us through Peter to follow the golden rule. Now, it's the golden rule rightly understood, not misunderstood. I get a laugh out of this. People like the golden rule until they don't. People like the golden rule until they understand what it means. Let me read it to you from Jesus. This is Matthew 7:12. Do for others as you would have them do for you. Now, in our enculturated, sinful ears, here's what we hear. Do for others as you would have them do for you, and they'll respond. Love others and they'll love you. Be kind to others and they'll be kind to you. Or at least you'll be rewarded. See, it sounds like a promise that if you are good to other people, they'll be good to you. And that fits our American culture. That fits our Western mindset. That people are inherently good. And if you do good to them, they'll do good to you. But that is not what Jesus says. Jesus says, irregardless of what they do, you do the right thing. And if you need evidence of that, let me simply remind you that Jesus, who gave the golden rule, lived a life of total love for everyone his whole life. And what did he get in response? Crucifixion. He sent his apostles out into the world to spread the gospel, and 10 of the 12 were martyred. And many Christians in many centuries, in many places, and I'll be honest with you, many times in your life you will find that when you live the golden rule, people will not respond favorably, and you will not be rewarded. But that's what you're called to do. God calls you to live for others as you would have them live for you. Grace and love for them regardless of what they do. The husband sacrifices for the wife independent of what she does, and the wife submits to her husband independent of his behavior. Maybe we could say that in addition to the golden rule, we recognize that grace rules. To the golden rule, I want to add that grace rules. See, for a person outside the community of faith who's not become a Christian yet, you get what you get, you earn what you earn, you get your wages. Every relationship they have is balanced. I do this for you, you do this for me. And they get what they earn. But for those of us in the community of grace, where grace rules, you and I have not received from God what we deserve. We deserved misery and grief, but we got mercy and grace, didn't we? God did not respond to what we did with reciprocal relationship to us. Thank God for that. Grace instead of grief. Instead of punishing us, God pardoned us. And so if you've been stamped with indelible grace, if God has set his love upon you, then he says in all of your relationships, especially marriage, you act independently and you love regardless of what you get back. Grace rules. I had a personal example of this recently. There's a relationship between two people I'm aware of, and it's difficult, and there's some hostility. And in my mind, it's quite clear. One has wronged the other, and one is getting away with it. And as I was praying about the situation, I became angry. And I said something like, Lord, I want justice. I want you to intervene, and I want you to fix this situation. I want justice to be done in this relationship. And immediately the Holy Spirit jogged my memory, and I remembered that the day before I had to pray for forgiveness. I had intentionally done something wrong, and when God broke my heart over, I had come to him and I had begged for forgiveness, grace, and mercy. And in the stillness of that moment, what I heard was, mercy for you, but justice for them. I had to say, Lord, I am so sorry. Mercy for me and mercy for them. Grace for me and grace for them. How can I, as one who's received grace and mercy, not pray that for someone else? In the same way, the husband who's received the grace of the gospel and the wife who's received the grace of the gospel must do their duties to their spouse regardless of what they do. It's an independent call. And I see two incredibly powerful applications here. I'm going to linger on both because they are world-changing, culture-challenging, life-enlightening. The first one is this gives us freedom from contractual relationships. Freedom from contractual relationships. I'm thinking of the kind of relationships that are proper in the business world. So if you work for your boss, he gives you a paycheck. If you work for a grade, your teacher will give you what you earn. We live in a contractual world. You do this and I'll do that. But if you don't do that, I won't do this. That's perfectly fine until we come to relationships. For Christians, you and I can't have contractual relationships, but we fall into them. An example is probably the easiest way to show this to you. Think about newlyweds. Even if they're married by a justice of the peace, they stand before friends and family and they look into each other's eyes and they make promises, right? Think about the traditional vows. In sickness and health, for rich or for poor, to death do us part. In that moment, I believe every couple is sincere. They're looking at each other and they're promising to each other that no matter what happens, they'll remain faithful. They start with a covenant marriage, whether they're believers or not. And people ooh and ah over them, and cynics say to them, oh, you're just newlyweds. Right now it's fun, but just wait. Just wait. And what those cynics are saying is that very quickly, that covenant relationship of, I would love to help you with that, or I would be glad to do that, becomes tit for tat. Arguments begin to ensue. Well, you aren't doing that, so I'm not doing this. Well, if you don't stop, I'm going to do this. And they begin to negotiate with each other. I will only if you. And their covenant love becomes a contractual relationship. It's dependent on each other. I love you if you, I will do for you when you. And that covenant relationship that's become a contractual relationship is heading for a cataclysm. In fact, it'll eventually end up with them calling it quits and divorce. What do people always say? Irreconcilable differences. Irreconcilable differences. In other words, we were negotiating and we kept trying and trying to negotiate and renegotiate our marriage, and in the end, it was irreconcilable. We couldn't quite get it worked out contractually. I wonder if somebody seeing this today, hearing this, thinks that's true about their marriage. That the way they relate to their spouse is if-then instead of independent. Let me give you encouragement. God can heal your marriage. God can pull you back into covenant love. God can pull you back into marriage that's joyful again, not hard. Now, all pastors do marriage counseling. It's been my privilege to do that over the years. I have a 40% success ratio. 40% of the couples that I get into marriage counseling stay married. And although I'm grieved by the 60% that don't, that's pretty good for a pastor. But let me tell you, I know the first day of marriage counseling whether it'll work. The only thing I need from them to do is to forget the past. So marriage counseling, first session, here's what I say. We will not talk about your past. I don't care, and neither does God. I don't care what you did to each other 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I don't care how he failed or she failed. If we can talk about the future, if we can go forward by grace and talk about the future and talk about how you should treat each other, not how you have, there's hope. And the couples that'll do that, and they'll dig in and reread the biblical roles here, sacrifice and submission, and they'll begin to do that, can make it. And the ones that are still bickering and fighting about the past and who did what, who said what, will never make it. Any marriage, any Christian marriage can be saved if you'll move back to covenant, unconditional, independent obedience to God. Freedom from contractual relationships. Parents do it with children, don't they? They move from covenant love, I'll love you no matter what, into you do this and I'll approve of you. Parenting situations can be rescued too. Application number 2 is freedom from fear of missing out. Sometimes you'll see that online, FOMO, fear of missing out. Here's what I'm looking at. The wife will be blessed by God regardless of what her husband does. And the husband can be blessed by God regardless of what his wife does. God deals with us as individuals even in a marriage. And so if the husband, we'll take for the first example, if the husband will sacrifice for his wife and live with her understanding way, even if he has the worst wife in the world, God will bless him. He can have joy. He can have peace. He can have prosperity. God can bless his socks off even while his wife is on the road to destruction. And a wife who digs in and she's willing to submit to her husband, even to an unbeliever, can be blessed no matter what happens to her husband. That's the first verse. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, what's Peter saying? He's saying to Christian wives, you submit to your unbelieving husbands. They're disobedient to the word. You get right with God. You do the right thing, and God will take care of you. Wives, you submit to your husbands as unto the Lord, and even if your husband's on the road to hell, and even if he never turns, God will bless you. Husbands, no matter what your wife does, no matter how she acts, you lay down your life for her, you sacrifice for her, and no matter what happens, whether God disciplines her as a Christian or sends her away forever, God will bless you. The power of independent roles in a marriage. They're independent. Each partner has an independent role. They have a voluntary role. This is so clever on the way the Lord works this out through Peter's words. I want to draw your attention in verses 1 and 7 to specific wording. Wives are told what wives should do, and husbands are told what husbands are to do, but not the other way around. My translation I'm reading from today is very literal. It actually substitutes a word in here. In the same way, you wives, verse 7, you husbands. What's happening is Peter's giving a command. If you say to someone, come, what you mean is you come, right? Or if you say to someone, speak, you're implying you speak. Or if you say to a young child, stop, you mean you stop. What I'm saying here is the command for a wife to submit is not given to the church or to the husband to enforce, it's given to the wife. The wife must submit to her husband voluntarily. It's a voluntary choice. The husband must go on honoring his wife even when she doesn't submit. And he is not to dishonor her, verse 7, he's to show her honor. He's not to dishonor her by battering her with words or actions or hands. He's not to beat her into submission. This is a command for the husband to lead, not lord. If the wife won't submit, that's an issue between her and God. And the husband is not to go around all the time saying, I'm the boss, I'm the master, submit. And husbands, let me just give you a practical leadership hint. If you keep having to remind somebody you're the leader, you're not. John Maxwell's right. Leadership has influence more than position. If you're always having to say to your wife, I am the husband, submit to me, you've lost the battle. Something's gone wrong. Wives must voluntarily submit, and the husband or friends, nobody else can put pressure on her to submit. It's a voluntary choice she must make before her God. And the wife of a husband, even if he's bad and harsh and unreasonable, should submit to him. You know, Peter said that back in chapter 2, verse 18. That even if masters are harsh and unreasonable and not gentle, servants should submit to them. And here he said, in the same way, verse 1, in the same way you wives be submissive. Peter is saying to a wife, no matter what your husband does, you must voluntarily submit, and you can't force him to lead. See, you can't submit to your husband and then beat him up because he's not a Christian. You can't henpeck him. You can't force him into the kingdom. You can't say, I'm a submissive wife, and then boss your husband around. You need to lead. You need to go to church. You need to. Who's leading who? That's rebellion, to batter your husband and try to force him to lead. To always be giving him a lecture. You're his wife, not his mother. Maybe Peter here, a married man, is remembering that very pithy proverb, Proverbs 21, verse 9. Better to live on the corner of a roof than to share a house with a nagging wife. Nagging is not submission, and husbands, lording is not leading. And so I want to say by application that the primary path to marital improvement is through prayer. The primary path to marital improvement is through prayer. Because the roles are voluntary, here's what I'm saying. I'm all for marriage counseling, marriage books, marriage seminars. But the primary way you will improve your spouse is by prayer. Wives, you should have a secret prayer list for your husband. You should never share it with him. It's a list of all the things that he does wrong and the things you need God to fix. And in private prayer, you and God alone, you pray that God will do it. And your private prayer list will become your private praise list. Because God will change your husband, especially if he's a Christian. It's your private list. You don't tell him what's wrong with him. You don't tell your friends what's wrong with him. You don't tell your mother what's wrong with him. Husbands, you need a private prayer list for your wife. What is it that's wrong? What does she struggle with? What do you need her to change? And you pray about it. You make a commitment to God. I will share this with you, Lord, every day, and I will not speak of it. I will not cut her down. I will not criticize her. You and you alone can change your attitude. And you don't share it with your friends. You don't share it with your mother. You don't complain about your wife. It's your private prayer list. The primary way God will improve your marriage is through prayer. And listen, I know sometimes situations get tough. I know that marriages go off kilter. I need to remind you of something I said 3 weeks ago. If you're in a marriage and you're experiencing abuse, or if you're in any relationship and you're experiencing abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse, you need to pick up the phone and call the authorities. God made authorities. He made government. Don't even finish the sermon. Just pause it and pick up the phone and call it in. Physical or sexual abuse, you always call the institution, the authorities. If it's unkindness, if it's a bad situation, then you have to follow the model of Jesus. Just prior to this, in chapter 2, verse 23, Peter says this of Jesus. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. Do you hear that? When Jesus received pain, when Jesus was suffering, he didn't hold it in. He didn't let it out. He let it up. Wives, when you're suffering in your marriage, and you will suffer, don't talk it out to other people. Don't hold it in and become depressed. Talk it up to God. Husbands, when you don't like what your wife's doing, again, don't hold it in. Don't let it out in gossip or slander. Let it up. May we always in our marriages be entrusting ourselves to Him just as Jesus did. That's the model. And God will honor you. I'm convinced that we either speak to others about our problems or we speak to God. You can't do both. When you speak to someone else about your problems, just forget praying about them. You must pray about your deepest needs, and God will answer you. The God who hears in secret will answer in secret, to borrow from Jesus' language in Matthew chapter 6. That's the application of voluntary relationships. Each partner has independent, voluntary, and supportive roles. What about supportive? Here what I mean is that both partners are working together. They're answering the call. Why does the wife submit? To help the husband do the Lord's will for them. It's for the purpose of honoring God better together. Remember, Genesis 2 already told us it's not good for the man to be alone. Wives, you're called in joint partnership with your husband to become one flesh and to help him fulfill God's call. And we have the example of Sarah in verse 6. So let me remind you, something I said last week but cannot be overemphasized. Sarah does something amazing. Now, Abraham's amazing. Let me give you what he does and then what Sarah does. I'm putting together a verse sandwich here. One slice is Genesis 12:1, and the other one's Hebrews 11:8. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you." He went out, not know where he was going. That is, Abraham went out with a direction but not a destination. So can you imagine this marital conversation? They finish dinner and Abram says to Sarai, "Hey Sarah, I have something to tell you." She says, "Yes." And he says, "Okay, you know this new God we've been worshiping?" "Yes." "Well, he's called us to go somewhere." "Great. Where are we going?" I don't know." "Well, what did he say?" "He said, leave everything behind. Leave our culture behind, our language, our inheritance, and all of our family, and go somewhere that I don't know where I'm going." Well, that's an amazing step of Abram to become Abraham. But for Sarai, who becomes Sarah, "Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord." Verse 6, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. Sarah must have said, "Yes, Lord, if the Lord has told you to do it, yes, Lord, we'll go." And together, Abram and Sarai become the father and mother of Israel. Great blessings, great honor. They're honored by all three major religions today for their faith. But it's not Abram, it's not Sarai, it's them together. That's the purpose. They're supportive roles together. Now, for wives, let me say there's a nice escape clause here, isn't there? If the call is to do it together for God, then you are not permitted or not required to do this if your husband's going the wrong way. You are to never to submit to something that directly dishonors God. If your husband clearly and biblically is going the wrong way, then you have to refuse. You refuse to obey, come what may, and whatever consequences come, you accept them. I see that in verse 6, the second half. "And you have become her children if you do what is right." You're not a daughter of Sarah if you do what's wrong. If you do what's right, without becoming frightened by any fear. Listen, ladies, it is difficult to say no to your husband. Today it could produce a severe argument in that culture for a believing wife to say to her husband, "I will not go with you to the temple of Zeus. I will not participate in immorality." There was no protection for her. And I'm sure that Christian wives in the first century suffered terribly at the hands of their unbelieving husbands, or their Christian husbands who were out of line. And Peter says, be like Sarah, be fearless. If your husband's going the right way, submit and go with him without fear. And if he's going the wrong way, if he's against the Lord, then your Lord has a higher claim on you than your Lord the husband. And you need to resist. Husbands, why do you sacrifice? To honor the wife by providing and protecting and partnering with her. Part of your calling before God is not only to change the world, but to love your wife, to live with her in an understanding way. That's part of your calling. I always worry about men who go to the mission field all the time and abandon their families. I worry about men who are always out doing ministry and never home, abandoning their primary responsibility, their primary mission field, to go do big and glamorous things for the Lord when they're not faithful at home. There's a place for going, but mainly we stay. There's an escape clause here for a husband. The husband is to give everything for his wife unless what the wife wants is wrong, because the husband is the primary direction setter in the home. He's the primary one who needs to discern what the Lord's calling them to do. So both live with each other, within each other's conscience, in a way that's sensitive. I can give you an illustration here. Christy and I have been married 18 years this month, and so I think of this a lot. When we got married, we decided that we would watch television and movies together. It's couple time. That's the only time we do it. And that we would bow to the conscience of the weaker person in the moment. If you were alive in the 1970s, I just barely remember this as a child, The Gong Show. It was one of the original talent shows. And somebody would get on there who thought they had a talent, and they'd start singing or juggling. And there were 3 judges, and any one of the judges could get up, if they didn't like it, and they take their mallet and hit that gong. And all it took was one judge, and it was over. And so what we do when we watch a show or a series is as soon as one of us says, hey, wait, then it's over. No discussion, no argument. We'll only watch a show or a series if both of us are perfectly fine with it, with our conscience before God. And that's pretty restrictive. We've only finished 3 series on television our whole marriage, one of which we regret. And my guess is that half the movies and the television shows we start, we don't finish. But we do it in a way that we do it together, following our call to be holy before the Lord. It's a supportive role in addition to being a voluntary and independent role. That's the first statement, number 3. Number 4, inner beauty beats outer beauty. Inner beauty beats outer beauty. Here I'm looking at what Peter says about adornment. Adornment's what you put on to look good, right? You adorn yourself with clothing and makeup, and men fix their hair, and adornment. 2 statements below this. Outer beauty is natural, but the love of outer beauty is naive. Outer beauty is natural, but the love of outer beauty is naive. What I'm saying is this: it is natural for us to notice beauty. Now, people will deny this and say that beauty is culturally determined, but it's not. When Mary and Jane play on the piano or the organ in the morning, they don't have a choice of chords. There are certain keys that sound right together. A chord is a chord. You can't make it something else. In the same way, beauty is natural. Sociologists are mystified by this, but here's the study, and they've repeated it many times. You take infants and you take adults, and you have adults take a series of pictures of people they don't know, and they rate them in attractiveness. So this is the most attractive picture all the way down. And amazing enough, if you hold those pictures up before an infant, infants stare at the most beautiful faces the longest. No one teaches an infant beauty, but they know it. Even in the Bible, there's at least 16 men and women in the Bible described as handsome or beautiful. To notice beauty is natural. There's no problem with that. But to love outer beauty is naive, because it can be fake. What you see is not always what you get. You learned that at some point in your life, or you're still paying the consequence. Appearances deceive. People are not always what they seem. Just because they're beautiful on the outside doesn't mean they're beautiful on the inside. They may look like a saint and they may curse like a sailor. Imagine if the M&M company began to print M&M packages that just had question marks on them. And so it's a mystery flavor. And so you could pick that M&M up and you could look at it, and it's beautiful, and it's got the candy coating, but you wouldn't know what's on the inside till you bite into it and discover whether it's coconut or some strange flavor of chili pepper. You don't really know what's the inside of the M&M till you get to it. To love outer beauty is foolish because it can be fake and it's always fading. No matter what beauty somebody has on the outside, no matter what adornment a woman must put on or man, it will always fade. Now, we fight this as a society. 4.3 million Americans had plastic surgery in 2018. This is cosmetic, not reconstructive. 4.3 million Americans went under the knife to look better. And I promise you, 2 years later, they look the same. You can't fight aging. Even the Apostle Paul said, 2 Corinthians 4:1, though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. To notice beauty, outer beauty, is natural, but to love outer beauty is naive. And inner beauty is supernatural, and the love of inner beauty is wise. Inner beauty is supernatural. I'm looking here at this phrase in verse 4, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. Now ask yourself this question. As God looks out over our world today, does God see all people as precious? No. We're not born precious. We're born ugly on the inside, aren't we? Sin. In fact, we're so ugly on the inside that Jesus had to die to pay for our ugliness. If you become a Christian, you've said, I remember when I said to God, I'm a sinner. What you said is, appearances are deceiving. I may look good to everybody on the outside, but on the inside, I'm rotten. Sin is being ugly on the inside. And so inner beauty is a supernatural gift. It's given to us. It's graced to us. When God looks down on you, woman, or looks down on you, man, and says, precious, that's grace. In fact, Jesus in the Bible is described as gentle and quiet. You have been given the traits of Jesus. You've been given credit for who Jesus is if you are supernaturally beautiful on the inside. It's graced and it's growing. That's what Peter's pointing out to here. Women, you've been made precious in the sight of God. Now grow in it. Grow in your gentleness and your quiet spirit. Men, grow in your leadership and your gentleness and your quietness. Graced and growing. Outer beauty is natural, but the love of outer beauty is naive. Inner beauty is supernatural, and the love of inner beauty is wise. 7 applications. The first one being an expansion upon this idea of inner beauty. Let me address women first. Women, you are loved by God, and you should be loved by other people for who you are. You are loved by God for who you are because you're being made in the image of Christ. You're a child of God. You are loved for who you are, and you should be loved by other people that way. And the benefits, women, for you are great. First of all, this meets your deepest desire. All women want to be loved for who they are, not what they do. Not contractual, but covenant. All women's deepest desire is to be loved for who they are inside, not what they do on the outside. And women, if you get a hold of that, then in addition to meeting your deepest desire, it will give you freedom. Freedom from what people think. If you get up every day and say, I am precious in the sight of God and should be precious in the sight of my husband and my children and my friends, you'll have freedom from opinion because everybody has an opinion regarding what you should do. Your deepest desire met because you're precious in the sight of God. Freedom from what other people think because you're precious in the sight of God, and then it'll let you set boundaries. Far too many women compromise their values and their esteem to try to be worth something to other people. They submit themselves to the whims of culture and relationships, and they become subservient to the opinions of others. But women, if you'll get up and say, my inner beauty is from Christ, your deepest desires will be met, you'll be freed from the pressure of opinions, and you'll set proper boundaries. What about for men? Let me address young men here. This means in your dating, you need to get to know the inside of a woman. There is no love at first sight, only lust at first sight. You can only tell if somebody's attractive on the outside until you get to know them. Again, last time I mentioned Christy and I, married 18 years. Our first date was 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, I asked her so many questions. I learned so much about her over a 2-hour lunch. Our second date was 8 hours. At the end of 10 hours of getting her to tell me about her life, I knew a lot about her. I knew a lot about her. We still dated a year and a half. I got to know her. I'm still getting to know her. Men, you will never fully get to know them, but you're supposed to pursue that. Young men, pursue a woman of inner beauty and outer beauty. And husbands, let me say that our charge is to continue to get to know our wives, to love what we see, and to celebrate it. To live with your wife in an understanding way means that our time and our attention is on our wives. They get our focus, and they get our celebration. For all Christians, this is a call to have a bigger inner life than an outer life. You have an outer life that people know, and you have an inner life. You know what we call it? If your outer life is bigger than your inner life, hypocrisy. If what people think about you on the outside is better than what's on the inside, that's hypocrisy. But if you'll cultivate a better inside than people know on the outside, that's called humility. One God will punish and one God will exalt. Are you growing to be a better person, a bigger person on the inside than on the outside? That's a call for all of us. For churches, this is a reminder that for pastors and elders, character trumps talent. I fear that many churches go and they hire the best sounding preacher. That they go and they hire the best educated. That they look at the resume and they say, wow, how talented, and they don't focus on the character. That's why Paul said elders can't be new Christians, because you haven't had a chance to get to know them yet. They're not tested yet. Character is always on the inside, and it's more important than talent on the outside. Second application is you may need to get saved today. Do you know that you're precious in the sight of God? Or are you still ugly? If you have not yet come to God and said, I am an ugly sinner, and I see the beauty of your Son on that cross dying for me, and I want that, you're still ugly in the sight of God. And someday He will say to you, depart. Get saved today. Ask somebody. Contact us at the church. But simply admit you're a sinner, believe Jesus died for you, and confess that privately and publicly. Number 3, husbands, are you sacrificing? You know, many men talk a big game about Jesus. I'll do this for Jesus, and I'll do this for Jesus. The primary way you serve Jesus is by serving your wife. Your primary way that you take up your cross and follow Jesus every day is by serving your wife and your family. Husbands, are you sacrificing? Number 4, wives, are you submitting? We saw here in verse 6 that submitting is at least obedience, but it's far more. It's respect and honor. Could your husband say to his friends, my wife honors me. My wife builds me up. Wives, are you submitting? Number 5, parents, are you encouraging inner beauty or outer beauty? What gets your praise directed to your kids? When your kid comes home, are they more celebrated for an achievement or for their character? What is it that they hear you praise? Because children are like plants that grow towards light. Children will grow in the direction of their praise they receive. Parents, focus on the inner beauty of your child. Help them to become a Christian and grow in grace. Praise their inner beauty over their outer beauty and what they accomplish. Number 6, grandparents, are you praying for your children's marriages? Are you praying? You're never to give up that role. You know, parents, the majority of your child's life will be spent married, not unmarried. The majority of the time you know your child, they will be married. You need to invest in that marriage they're in with prayer and, if necessary, with nudging. I'm going to talk next week about the boundaries here because marriage relationship is supreme. But grandfathers, you may need to say to your sons, shape up. Sacrifice for your wife the way I sacrificed for your mother. And older women, you may need to say to your daughters, submit. Submit to your husband and love him and the children the way you saw in me. There's an okay role for adult parents to nudge their children. And number 5, all of us, are we living joyfully as heirs of grace? That's what Peter concludes with. Show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. Oh, believer, you and I have a great future. Whether in death or his descent, Jesus is coming for us. Someday, we have an inheritance. We'll be able to see Jesus in all his glory and be with him forever. What a great destiny. Are you living that way as an heir of grace? May the Lord give us the ability to live joyfully every day as recipients of his grace. Amen.